Thank you. Now, do I? Oh, I have to do that.
Yeah. If you can share screen. Can I just ask everybody to mute themselves, please?
Just before I do that, can I just say my screen's going to go blank. I'm going to sit and watch it with Tessa on her computer, and then I'll come back at the end of the meeting.
Okay.
Right, I hope you can all see it now.
Yes.
Excellent. Right. Well, it says 150 different weeds in your garden. Oh dear. And I think that was the reaction of one or two of our neighbours. I don't think they actually said that, but that was the impression they rather gave. This slide has Crepis capillaris, I think, and a patchwork leafcutter bee, I think. And the I thinks are because I'm an ecologist rather than a botanist or an entomologist or any particular ology. And so I'm much more likely to see the wood than the trees and think, oh, Pinus sylvestris and Hylocomium splendens. Right, W18 wood, right, we'll go on to the next one. So I really don't look at things in detail often, but I do try. And I promised Mary that I would stick mostly to wild plants. That's not these fungi, nice though they are, and not this beautiful yellow underwing, which is demonstrating that not all moths are brown. And it's sitting on some very luridly coloured garden thyme. So I'll leave those sort of things out. I started to look and oh, I did mean to say that Dave Goulson has a very nice quote, the wonderful Dave Goulson, in one of his books. It says, the foundations of a wildlife garden are, of course, the plants. They are at the bottom of the food chain, the footings on which everything else is built. So the plants are really important. I started to look at the garden plants or the weeds in detail during the first lockdown because the BSBI ran a small project, and the idea was that people would count the number of species in their gardens and identify all the species. They thought this would help people to learn to identify things, become better at ID. It thought that it would give them some data, and they did indeed get quite a lot of data. They got 16,000 records of 671 species in 627 gardens, which is quite a lot. The average number of wild species in a garden, though, was only 25. My 150 was perhaps reduced to about 110, 120, because they took out all the trees and all the shrubs and all the neophytes. That's things which were introduced into the UK after about 1500. So we've got quite a few of those, but we've still got rather more than the average number of species. You'll be interested to learn that the top species in everybody's garden was dandelion, which is also one of the really, really exuberant species in our garden. Our garden started off with some, when we came in, there were some rather scrappy lawns and some overgrown rockeries and a few shrubs which weren't doing very much. And there was an enormous Douglas fir. It was 24 meters high and it was in the south corner and it totally shaded the garden, so we got it cut down. Our garden, incidentally, is quite large. It's about 1,800 square meters, which works out at a little bit under half an acre, or in metric, a little bit under a fifth of a hectare. But that includes the footings of the house and the garage and everything, so there's not quite that much to work on. We started doing our work in the garden in about 2018, after we'd had the builders in, and I'm afraid builders do tend to make a mess of a garden, and they moved all the soil around, and they put rubble down, and they covered the rubble with some very nice stuff, which I do much appreciate. It's a sort of mixture of stones and sand, and I suppose you'd call it hardcore, but it's not particularly hard. And the builders wanted to cover it with soil, but I said, no, that's splendid, please leave it. And they couldn't understand, but I'm ever so pleased that that's what we did. Anyway, we started to work on the garden in about 2018, and we decided to get some help because it was really quite hard work. And we got these chaps in and a digger, and this is what we ended up with a big pond here, and you can see this slope with all the mixty-maxty soil, and we got a beach, and this area here, which is where all the debris from the pond went, and you can see into our wood at the back there. It's a very small wood, a very small piece of an existing wood that we bought very, very expensively from Seafield Estates, but I reckon it was worth doing. And we did some work ourselves. Here we are digging a marsh here, because if you've got a pond and you want marsh plants, you can't just plant them all in a shallow bit of the pond, because otherwise they transpire and all the water in your pond disappears more or less overnight. So we didn't want that to happen. So we've got a separate marsh in here. You dig a hole and line it with, well, we used bits of old pond liner because it doesn't have to be completely waterproof. It has to drain through slowly. And this is a map of our back garden. I did it for a course I was doing on solitary bees. So ignore all the writing in red because that's about bees, but it gives you some idea. We've got the big pond, we've got this big bank with low fertility soil. We've got trees around the edges, and this is the stump of the giant tree. And we've got wild raspberries and heathers and some fruit and a flower bed near the house with garden flowers. They're all chosen to be insect friendly, but they are nevertheless ordinary garden flowers. And that's what it looks like in reality. This will be about early May, I should think. And here's the flower bed cut down, ready for growth. And here's the slope, and it's covered in dandelions. And here's the pond here, and the beach, and you can just see into the wood there. And this bit down here is what we call the river, but it's actually a ditch, and it more or less stops running in late summer, but it still introduces yet another habitat. The idea is to have as many habitats as possible for the plants and the insects. Now, I didn't know how to do this. I wasn't sure whether to just run through all the species because I've taken lots of photos over the summer. But I thought 150 species, you get 20 seconds each, and it would be jolly boring. So I've just picked out a few groups. Some of them are groups which I myself find very, very difficult, like yellow composites. And I hope my identification is at least reasonable. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of them. And other groups are like what we've done with the pond and things like that. So I hope you're quite interested. This is the first yellow composite that comes. It's coltsfoot. I'm not sure whether I introduced it or it's come naturally, because I did plant some seeds and a couple of wee plants that I'd grown from seed of coltsfoot. And then they didn't come up, but then these coltsfoot came up in a completely different part of the garden. So I don't suppose they're the same, but you never know. And then there are lots and lots and lots of dandelions. Now, dandelions are an insect plant par excellence. Lots of insects use them. And they're cheerful, and I really like dandelions. These dandelions I have two problems with. One is they have long tap roots, so they vigorously bring up nutrients from underneath, deep underground, and put them on my poor soil on the slope, which is kept poor to try and encourage a wide variety of wild plants. This year I've sown some yellow rattle to see if that can sort of get over this strange effect. But I sowed it in August and it's not come up yet, obviously, because it has to go in and vernalise. And the other problem with dandelions, of course, is that they produce these things, and then you get baby dandelions absolutely everywhere. But you can pull them out so long as they're quite small. When they get a bit larger, it's a bit more difficult. This, I think, is Crepis capillaris. It's rather larger than I'm used to seeing in further south, but I think that's it. And it's a very, very popular plant with solitary bees. They love it. And I know it's a Crepis because it has this flask-shaped involucre. And the involucre has two different lengths of involucral bracts. It has short ones and long ones. And that contrasts with this next plant, which is Hippocaris radicata, the cat's ear. And that has a whole mixty-maxty lot of involucral bracts. And they've got purple tips, and it doesn't have this flask-shaped involucre. And it also has very, very hairy leaves. And these leaves, the hairs are straight. They don't have little Y-shaped tips. If they have little Y-shaped tips, you'd think it might be a kind of Leontodon. But I don't have any Leontodons at the moment, though I'm trying to introduce Leontodon autumnalis as was, and it's now called Scorzonorides autumnalis, and I'm trying to grow that on the verge in front of the house, but nothing's come up yet. But I only planted it last autumn, so you wouldn't expect anything yet. And this is yet another yellow composite, and it's a bit of a, it only produces one flower at a time, so it's not great for pollinators. And I know it's really, really good for aphids, but it's very invasive, and there was a lot of it. So I thought, oh, I'll just pull it all out and then I won't be troubled with it. And the third one I pulled out, this moth fluttered out. And this is called the shark. You could perhaps imagine that this is a shark at the front where it's got this little horny bit. But it's a shark moth. And surprise, surprise, its food plant is prickly sow thistle. So I thought I'd better leave it. Now, we also have lots and lots and lots of wee white crucifers, and they're a problem as well. This is obviously Aerophila, whitlow grass. I'm not sure which one. In Stace, it says a much understood genus, a much misunderstood genus. So if he was confused, I can be confused, I reckon. I'll have another look next year, or maybe somebody can help me. Any suggestions, welcome. And this is one everybody's probably got, though we didn't have in Berwick. It needs acid soil that's well drained. And this is Arabidopsis thaliana, the thale cress. And it's the sort of weed that you have to think about it as you pull it out, because there's a lot of it. And it looks like this at first, with hairy leaves, a hairy rosette at the bottom, and these little flowers at the top. And only too soon it grows into something like this, with lots and lots of seed pods. And 5 minutes later, you think, oh, well, I'll pull it out tomorrow. And you go tomorrow and you touch the seed pods, and the seeds fire absolutely everywhere. So it's really difficult to get rid of. But this strange thing that makes it a perfect weed, it is also absolutely a perfect research plant. It's sort of the botanist's Drosophila, you might say. It has a short generation time, 6 weeks. It has synchronized flowering. They all flower together, more or less, only not all of them, because then some more come. It has many, many, many seeds per plant. It's very easy to grow. It's small, so you can get lots and lots in your laboratory bench or your greenhouse. It can self-fertilize, or you can just cut off the stamens quite easily, and then you can cross it with whatever you like. It has a wide geographic range, so wherever you're working, you're bound to find some. It has only 5 chromosomes, which is very few for a flowering plant, though there are 25,500 genes, which is going to take quite some working through, less now. It supposedly has no mycorrhizal or rhizobial symbionts helping in the roots, though I bet if people looked even harder, they'd find some. It seems very unlikely that it doesn't have any. Anyway, it was the first vascular plant to have its genome sequenced, and that was in December 2000, which is quite a long time ago. It's been grown in the space station in 0 gravity to see what happens, and I think basically, not surprisingly, with no gravity to go, it just grew towards the light, which is what you'd expect would happen, but you know, they did it. And if you put Arabidopsis thaliana into a search engine, you'll get hundreds and hundreds of papers coming up, none of which I can understand because they're all sort of deep genetics. But anyway, I think of that when I weed it out yet again, that it's an important plant. I have 2 hairy bittercresses in our garden. There's the ordinary one, which I expect you all have, Cardemone hirsuta, and there's the wavy bittercress, which grows down by our ditchy bit under the bridge where it's dark, and it's a much laxer plant and slightly taller, but it's not that different. The main difference seems to be that you can see, if you can find the stamens, hairy bittercress has 1, 2, 3, 4, and the wavy bittercress has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, as long as you can find the stamens, and there's usually a flower out somewhere in the plant, you can identify them. This is Smith's pepperwort, Lepidium heterophyllum, which I'd never seen before we came to this area. But Stuart across the road says it's quite common. But there are 2 very similar pepperworts. There's this one and there's Lepidium campestri, which is field pepperwort, surprisingly enough. And that's an annual. And this one is definitely a perennial, because if you're working in the garden, it's really nice because you can look at it one year and you go back and you think, oh yes, it's come up in exactly the same place. It must be a perennial. And the other difference is that the Smith's pepperwort has the style projecting a little bit beyond the notch of the fruit, whereas the field pepperwort doesn't. This is Jack by the Hedge, Aureliaria petiolata, which I think is probably not exactly native to the garden. It came in with a load of soil, and I've kept it going ever since, mostly for the butterflies. This is a lady orange tip, and she's laying eggs on the stems of the fruit. There is an egg, which is appropriately enough orange, laid on the stem of the fruit. Apparently, these orange tips actually like Cardamone pratense in this area, but I haven't been able to grow that in the garden. Every time it gets going, big slugs crawl out and take off the top. It was in the garden when we first came, so I should be able to grow it, but I can't. Anyway, I shall read you this. It is believed that the orange tips of the male, that's the male orange tip, are an example of warning coloration, indicating that the butterfly is not particularly palatable to predators, a result of the mustard oils that have accumulated in the body from the larval food plant. I am not sure if I believe it, because if those little orange tips are really effective at getting rid of predators, why have no lady orange tips got the same thing? Or indeed the small whites or the large whites or the green vein whites. But never mind, we'll pass over that. What I will tell you a little about, you probably know all about this, but if you don't, or if you do, you can talk among yourselves, and if you don't, you can listen. And that is that it says, as a result of mustard oils that have accumulated in the body from the food plant. And of course, the insects and the flowers are engaged in a war of attrition, a sort of escalating war of attrition. And the food plants, the brassicas that have the most bitter mustard oils in them, will perhaps be rejected except by a few of the orange tips caterpillars who are able to cope. So these orange tip caterpillars that are able to cope have more food available to them, so they do well. And so gradually all the orange tips are able to cope. And then once the orange tips are better able to cope with the accumulated mustard oils, you get one plant which has even more. And then the orange tips find this difficult. But this process repeats and repeats and repeats. So you get this war of attrition going on. And this is why insects often, and particularly butterflies and moths, have particular food plants. They've adapted, they've grown up with the food plants and they've evolved together and they're stuck together now forever. It's interesting too that a lot of plants which have quite toxic leaves don't have toxic flowers, because obviously they want insects. If they're insect pollinated, they want insects to come and pollinate them. So the nectar and the pollen are not poisonous. Comes together. Right. As well as these little white crucifers, we have a lot of veronicas in the garden. This one is Veronica chimedris, the Germander speedwell, which I'm sure you all know, and I'm sure you've got it growing in your garden, and it's pretty rampant. It's really a big thug, but it's quite pretty, it really is. So I've got it in some parts of the garden. And then one day we were admiring a particularly bright patch of Veronica chimedris, and I'm not sure which one of us spotted it, but there's this tiny little moth, and it really was small, as you could see from the fingers behind. And I couldn't identify it, but Mike Taylor, who's the moth bloke, he managed to identify it from a photograph. And it's the smallest of the longhorns. Not surprisingly, it's called the small longhorn. And if you look at in the right-hand side at the bottom here, which I can't see, unfortunately, because your pictures are across it. This is from the NBN, and our records are the ones in the middle. They're about here-ish, I think. And this doesn't include my records, but you can see it's not got many records. I expect this is because the moth is so small and only pops out occasionally, and it's not been recorded very often. I doubt if it's rare, but it might be. Anyway, it's well worth growing Germander speedwell, even for that. We also have Veronica arvensis, which is wall speedwell, but it mostly grows in the flower bed. There's Veronica serpillifolia, which is the time-leaved speedwell, which has got these whitish flowers and practically hairless leaves. I don't know why it's called time-leaved. This picture is not taken in our garden because I missed the slot when it was out in our garden. It's taken at the RSPB tree nursery, which is where I help as well. And then this one's Veronica persica, the common field speedwell. This is a neophyte, a plant that is introduced, not quite sure where from. There's these little cards are helpful in saying. Oh yes, Southwest Asia. And it must have come into the country since 1500. And it's an annual, which causes quite a lot of problems because you only get 1 or 2 single stems with the seed, with the flower and then the seed heads in each plant. And then they have to seed and grow again. And if it's growing in grass, you have to make sure that the grass is short enough so that the seeds can fall onto the soil so that they can germinate properly and get going for next year. But on the other hand, if you cut the grass too short, you cut off all the seed heads and the plants, the flowers and the seed heads. So it's usually a scissors job. I've only got a little patch, but I go round with a pair of old kitchen scissors, which is a bit eccentric. But there's 2 other Veronicas. There's Veronica Becker-Bunga, which I'm sure you all know, brook lime, and it forms great big clumps in the pond, and it's quite nice, but it has relatively small flowers. And then the other one, which I'm extraordinarily proud of, is Veronica scutavata, the marsh speedwell. And I obtained 2 little seed heads. I won't go into details. And I nicked them from somewhere. And there were 7 seeds in them. And I just scattered these 7 seeds in an area where I thought that Veronica scutavata might like it. And it obviously did, because I came up. So really pleased. This is our front lawn last summer. We don't really grow grass. There is grass there underneath, but we try and cover it up. And this is lovely. It was like this summer when it was very dry. It was like this for maybe a month, and then we cut it. We only cut it about 3 times this last year, and it all came again. And there's white clover and red clover. The white clover has had a little help. I have seeded in other white clovers, and although it's supposed to be wild white clover, and I got it from Scotia Seeds, and it's proper Scottish wild white clover, it does look rather different, but it's in there anyway. And the bees love it, and passers-by sometimes even stop and say, wow, that's great. So I'm very pleased with that. And if you see, there's little yellow bits underneath as well. So Daisy there, struggling up with little yellow bits. And these little yellow bits are also clovers. There's lesser trefoil, Trifolium dubium, which has just a few florets per head. And the keel, the top florets, the top petals on each flower, folds itself like a roof over the developing seed pods, so you can't really see them. Whereas this one, the hot trefoil, has more florets per head, and its keel that doesn't fold itself, it just droops down like a little roof, and it covers each pod, and so it looks a bit like a cone or a hop. And if you come across something which has mucronate leaf tips, like these little leaf tips go into a little spike, and it has curly black flowers, that's black medic. Curly black seeds, that's black medic. The next lot of plants I'm going to show you are what one of our daughters, who's done too much NVC, said, oh, tall ruderals, Mum. and that's hogweed. And this is what happens to our hogweed often. I find it very difficult to grow. It's this balance. If you grow plants for the wildlife and then the wildlife eats it, I never know whether to be pleased or not pleased, because it's a double-edged sword, as you might say. But however, I was delighted to get this little moth, which is called Pamen orana, and it didn't do all this damage here because its caterpillars eat the flowers and the seeds. And because it eats the flowers and the seeds, you don't get any baby Heracleums the next year. So I sometimes have to supplement it, but there's always lots of Heracleums around that I can just pinch a few seeds from. The same applies almost more to the Angelica. It's an absolute magnet for insects. You can see this, there's hoverflies coming in. That's a sawfly. This solitary wasp, sorry, not solitary, social wasps, a couple there. And I was delighted to get this hoverfly here because I first found that in the village pond, which is about 500 meters away from us. And obviously one or two of them have flown this 500 meters and have found my Angelica, and I was absolutely delighted. Fumarias. These are proper weeds. I haven't grown them for any particular reason. They just came all by themselves. I know nothing about what kind of animals might live on them. But I was astonished to find I have 2 species of Fumaria. I thought I'd better sit down with the book and see what I've got. I seem, as far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, I seem to have common ramping fumitory, which has broadish petals like parsley, and it has sort of teardrop-shaped sepals here at the base of the fruit. And the fruit are quite long and have a wee knobble that is for style on the top. And I've also got common fumitory, which is a much narrower plant altogether, and it has narrower sepals, and its fruit are much broader, still with the little knobble on the top, but they're a different shape. Anyway, I'm fairly certain of that ID. That's the best I can do. Violas, we have quite a lot of violas. There's the field pansy, and if anybody's puzzled by the difference between a pansy and a violet, pansies have lots of very much divided stipules at the base of their leaves. So you get great big sort of leafy masses at intervals all up the stem. And violets you don't. So we have field pansy and common dog violet. They've appeared entirely by themselves in the garden. And this one is an import, a neophyte. It's the horn pansy, and it comes from the Pyrenees, and you can see why it's called the horn pansy. It's got this great big spur here. And I don't think I introduced it because although I was growing a garden white variety of this, I planted it just about the same time this appeared, and I don't think the seeds kind of seeded in a month or two. I think it's come entirely by itself. And then there's another pansy in the garden, and it doesn't seem right for Viola tricolor, the wild pansy. It doesn't seem right for Viola lutea, the mountain pansy. And it's not exactly a garden pansy either. And I think it might be a mixture of all 3, which they've given this name, Vitrockiana, possibly. Again, if anybody's got any suggestions as to what it might be, I'd be absolutely delighted. However, the beasts that feed on them don't seem to worry at all, because you can see here is a social wasp, which is drinking the nectar from the base of the spur of this gardenish type pansy. And as well as drinking the nectar from the base of the spur, it's stealing the nectar. It hasn't come in the right way to get pollen on it and pollen on the next plant. It's bitten a little hole at the base of the spur and it's just sucking the nectar out directly. Anyway, it seems quite happy. Now, pond and its surroundings. This is a completely new habitat in the garden. So most of the plants were introduced, or they've introduced themselves. This is the pond itself, and that's the marsh behind with the yellow loosestrife, which I planted in. And there's also purple loosestrife comes later on in the year that I've planted in. Anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the pond plants. This is a white anemone, Nymphea alba. It was actually the very, very first plant we planted into the pond. It was quite exciting, and we lowered it in on a sort of pulley system made out of an old washing line and plonked it in, and it grew. So we're delighted. But a little bit later on, I decided to buy some more white water lilies from another supplier, and they seem much more into wild plants, and they send out their pond plants bare rooted, which is great because they're much cheaper and you can plant them in whatever you want to plant them in, and it's all together much better. Anyway, they say it could be argued that that's the Nymphea alba, is a plant that doesn't really exist. The reasons for this is that the true native plants were dug up by enthusiastic Victorians, keen to cross it with all the new exciting species being found abroad to produce coloured hybrids. Rejects that looked like the original species were often replanted, and only the best were kept for sale. Hence, the Nymphea alba sold today are probably not genetically pure. Well, sounds sensible, sounds likely, but does it matter in a garden? I've got lots of weird things in the garden. People, because I'm interested in bees, people kindly keep giving me bee seeds, or whatever they're called, you know, not seeds to grow bees, but seeds to grow flowers that are suitable for bees. And they have all sorts of weird things in. So I've got Galium malugo, which is a Galium which is indeed working north. When we moved into Northumberland about 40 years ago, I found a Galium malugo, and I put the record into the local recorder, and he said, no, we don't get this that far north, it's just coming. So he went to have a look, and it was, which was a relief to me. But it's obviously moving north, and now 40 years later, it's moved up to this part of the world. But I think in this case, I gave it a great helping hand. And we also have Lotus corniculatus, the bird's foot trefoil, Vase sativa, which is the kind that it's much taller than the normal Lotus corniculatus. And that's obviously come in with these seeds suitable for bee plants. I don't know what you think about that. Does it matter in a garden? Because I think this garden wildlife, I mean, there are lots of animals and plants in our garden that I'm absolutely delighted to have. But once we leave this house, who's going to come in? I mean, they might be interested in wildlife or they might not. They might put it all down to one single species of lawns, single grass species lawns, 1/4 of an inch high, and a few rhododendrons. And then all this wildlife will disappear. Something to think about. Anyway, to get back to the pond species, these are some that I planted in. Caltha palustris, the marsh marigold. I could have nicked the seeds from the pond down the road, but it is the village pond and it's right in the middle of the village, and I didn't want to. It grows brilliantly from seeds, so if anybody ever wants some, just let me know. And this one I bought as Chernoplectus /Scirpus lacustris. the common club rush. There's a similar plant called Scirpus tabernaemontanus, which grows in saltier areas, and it has this sort of glaucous look, and it's a bit small. And this one has a sort of glaucous look, and it's a bit small. So I wasn't sure, but I managed to get a picture of it when it was flowering. And it says 3 stamens in Scirpus lacustris per floret. And I don't know if you can count 3, but there's certainly lots of stamens per floret here. So I'm sure the bloke was right. And Devon pond plants have come up trumps, and it's what they say it is. I've got some plants in from seed around the pond, as well as the Veronica, the marsh Veronica. I've got Lychnus cuculi, the ragged robin, which a friend gave me seeds of, and I've got lots of seeds of that if anybody wants some. I've got Carex echinata, which came from a few seeds which somehow found their way into my pocket one day and have been scattered. I've got some rushes that come themselves. I get far too many Juncus conglomeratus or effusus or something, but I try and root those out. They have quite big roots too, but they can come out because I don't want them. But this is Juncus bufonius, the toad rush. It came all by itself, and it's an annual. It's a very small plant. If you give a good tug and it comes up, it's an annual, and it's Juncus bufonius. And if it's quite firmly rooted, a small rush like this, it's probably Juncus bulbosus, the bulbous rush. And you can see the little bulbils here, some of which have even got little green bits coming out of them. And these will fall down and grow among the stones. And it has 2 sort of forms. It's the same plant, but it has a terrestrial form here, and it also has an aquatic form, so that if the seeds fall into the middle of the pond and have nowhere to park themselves, it still grows quite vigorously in this sort of mat. And these are some plants which I was more surprised about when they came. There's Alisma plantago aquatica, water plantain, which isn't at all common around here anyway, but it does grow in the village pond. And I blame the ducks, because there's a mallard pair who nest on the village pond every year, but they come and visit us sometimes. And I'm sure they came from the village pond to our pond and brought seeds of this plant. And then the Scrofularia nodosa and common figwort, sorry, the thing has got covered. And I've just got one plant. It came up in the marsh entirely by itself. And I'd like to have a few more because it's quite a handsome plant. And it's very, very, very popular with social wasps. It's obviously well pollinated, but I haven't been able to grow any seed. Maybe it's not viable. Maybe you need 2 figwort plants, but I don't know. Still working on that one. Now, Audrey will recognise this, and Stuart Taylor would. He showed us one last month. It's the narrow-bordered bee hawk moth, and it's nectaring on a garden plant, this Lithodora here. And anyway, this is what happened a bit later on. We had several narrow-bordered bee hawk moths. They're much, much easier to photograph when they're busy like this. But then after they've done that, they need somewhere to lay the eggs. And Stuart's field that he talked about had lots and lots of Succisa pratensis in. And fortunately, it's a plant which wasn't local, which wasn't in our garden, but I've liked, and it's really good for all sorts of wildlife, so I've been growing it. So I'm really hoping that whichever of these is the female has laid on our Succisa, but I'm not quite sure. Which really brings us back to a sort of conclusion. Except here, which is quite different. But in Berkshire, where we were, and in much of England and a lot of bits of Scotland, the countryside as such is relatively sterile. It has relatively few flowering plants in it, and therefore relatively few insects. And gardens in the UK cover about 5,000 square kilometres. To put it in perspective, the Cairngorms National Park is about 4,500 square kilometres. So it's an area bigger than the Cairngorms National Park. And I'd like to see wildflowers in all of these. Not entirely wildflowers, but some. And it doesn't matter if you only have 25 different wildflowers, weed species, and dandelions at the top, because our dandelions this year hosted lots of species of bumblebees, including the Blaeberry bumblebee, lots of butterflies, including the small copper and a comma, lots of solitary bees, lots of hoverflies, beetles, flies, and not to dismiss the larger beasts, goldfinches as well, who came for the seed. So that they really are very good plants. So, weeds, are they important in the garden? They can look good, as I discovered when we were selling our previous house, because I regret to say the garden was looking a bit of a mess. So I weeded it thoroughly and then it looked a bit bare. So I moved some of the prettier weeds around and it really looked quite nice. Didn't want to pay money for new plants. Anyway, it looks good. It helps biodiversity. And all these wild plants, they're free. They're pesticide free. They're peat free. No peat has been used in growing them. No air miles from flying them in from Holland. They're brilliant doers. They do really well. So by all means, grow lots of fruit and lots of vegetables and lots of exotic imported flowers, though try and keep to single flowers and not the double ones. So the single ones are much, much better for pollinators. But as well as that, will you please welcome your weeds? Right, that's it.
Thank you, Fiona. That was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
It's difficult to tell from the reaction when it's just heads. It'd be easier with real, face to face. But
no.
Now, any questions or thoughts?
I'm interested in how you're developing your garden. I've allocated a part of my garden to become like a wildflower garden, and I've planted a lot of yellow rattle. I've sowed a lot of yellow rattle seeds in it over the last couple of years.
Yes.
And my strategy has been waiting for things to appear, and the thugs have appeared, but I'm waiting to see whether more delicate ones, as the rattle takes hold and gets rid of the grass. Before it was just a regular mown lawn.
Well, I think it depends what sort of soil you've got. We were lucky in that we had this sort of subsoil that the builders had left. But I do pull the thugs out and leave bare ground and hope things will seed themselves in. And I do scatter seeds, which are bought or acquired or given or something. And I do sometimes sow the seeds in trays and grow little plants and put the plants in. But I think on the whole, if you can work out where your particular plant is going to thrive, if you just scatter some suitable seeds, as soon as the seeds are ripe into that area, which is presumably what happens naturally, a lot of them come. But it's a continuous, you have to work at it all the time, and it changes slightly. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's evolved, it can change all the time, but it needs just gentle nudging, I think, a lot of the time. I mean, normally we'd have herbivores grazing, but we don't have any herbivores. It's just my husband with the mower or me with the shears or the strimmer. And it's quite hard work, actually, but being a pretend herbivore, but needs must, you know.
I know it sometimes doesn't make you popular with the neighbours when they see the dandelions and the clover and the roseberry willow herb. I just say it's good for the bees, it's good for the planet. But,
yes, we're very lucky with our neighbours. We had masses and masses of ragwort, and the people next door have horses. So I let it flower and then I pulled the lot out. And we still have a bit of ragwort that comes, maybe 20 plants. And I let it flower, and then as soon as it starts seeding, I pull it all out. And more seems to come anyway. But the other neighbours, they seem to have roseberry willow herb. In fact, I curse them because even more roseberry willow herb comes from them than we get.
Has anyone got any questions or comments they'd like to make to Fiona?
No? What about this bringing in flowers that are not wholly native? Does this matter? Even if they're supposed to be native, like the white water lilies, for example. Do you think this is a problem, or should I just ignore it? I'm ignoring it, but maybe I shouldn't be.
Does someone want to answer their opinion?
No.
I think it's all right as long as it's in your garden, but I wouldn't go introducing them into the wild.
Yes, I agree with that, Mary, definitely. Yes.
I like the look of your pond. I built a huge wildlife pond in my area and had to take it out because a beautiful little white flowered plant appeared and was flourishing.
Ah, New Zealand pygmy weed.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. By the time I realised what it was too late.
Yes.
And the only way I could do it was kill everything in the pond. So
yes.
I've got rid of I've done that. I've got rid of the pond. In fact, I've now sold the land that the pond was in, but it was just heartbreaking.
Yes, it's really.
And that had come, I think, on the feet of a bird. You know, we don't get we never had ducks in the pond, but we had lots of other birds coming into the pond, and I think it must have come in that because I'd not introduced anything.
Yes, that's really bad luck. I do. People sometimes offer me pond plants, and I have accepted some, but you have to be really, really careful.
Yeah.
I mean, seed is okay, because you can look at the seeds and make sure you're not planting anything that you shouldn't. But once it's in the pond, it's impossible to get out.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot in Berwick. There was a big gardens, and they had 3 or 4 ornamental ponds, and they had great crested newts in them. So they couldn't do anything about the ponds, but they were absolutely covered in this New Zealand pygmy weed, and it wasn't a good thing.
Yeah. No, because once it's in your place, it then moves on somewhere else into another waterway, another pond, and so it goes on. Yeah, yeah. Well, my newts had to find a home somewhere else, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about anyone else, but this has inspired me to go and count the wild species of plant I've got in my own garden next summer. And I wonder if anyone else at the meeting is interested in doing the same thing, and we can kind of compare, maybe we could compare notes, have a little survey of our own gardens over the next 12 months.
There's never enough time in the summer, Elizabeth.
Pardon?
There's never enough time in the summer.
Well, I find there's enough time to pick them, but not to actually decide what they are, especially.
Well, just snap them with your phone. photograph them with your phone.
Especially it's the grasses that grasses. I thought there's not that many rushes, but lots of different grasses, and it just at the end of the day, I just got floored.
Can I just say, I thought the photography was wonderful. I loved all your photos of the flowers and all the beasties as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you, Mary.
Absolutely stunning.
Yes,
I hope there weren't too many beasties.
Oh no, I
Oh,
like
no.
the beasties.
I like the beasties.
I like your the chocolatey brown micro moth, the Pamini aurana. So
Oh,
everybody should have lots of hogweed in their garden, and then the
Yeah.
last week in June or the first week in July, that's the time to look for them, because they're super little creatures, just lovely. So hogweed and angelica are magic plants.
I meet Mary sometimes walking up the lane looking at all the flower heads.
I count them every summer.
Yeah. I think you were too thorough in all your descriptions, you know. Well, no, not too thorough, but you know, you were so good at describing things.
Excellent.
well,
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time scratching my head over them.
Yes.
The great thing about plants in the garden is that if you can't identify it today, you can always look tomorrow. And if the pea suddenly said seeds something and it's just flowering, you can wait until it seeds, which you can't normally.
Yeah. I must have a look at your violet, the one that I would have said was viola tricolor without any doubt, and you gave it a fancy hybrid name. Yes.
Well, maybe it is tricolor.
Well, I mean, just looking at the photo, that's what I would have said, but I don't know anything about the one that you ended up calling it.
Well, that's just a hybrid between tricolor and the garden pansy and
Right.
possibly others.
It's certainly very beautiful.
Yeah. Right. Is it?
Anything else anyone wants to add?
I wanted to ask, is Viola arvensis, is that what we know as heartsease?
Oh, well, Ian's going to tell you that.
Hmm?
Ian's going to tell you the answer to that one.
No, it's not. Viola tricolor is a heartsea.
Heartsease.
No, I think it's called field pansy, but yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona, for your contribution. And it was great not having to leave my house to get to see it. And I'm sure it's even better for your folk
It
in the
is.
space side. So I think it was the right decision the committee made to continue our winter programme on Zoom. So it means it's much easier for us all, or all but a few, to take part without risk of life and limb in travelling.
Yes, well, I'm very, very pleased. What's the temperature gone down to now, Maurice? Yeah. Oh, minus 8.2, and it's snowing.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's just started snowing here as well.
So
well, I just have to go across the road to get to my house, so I'm not too far away. Before we finish, just to remind people of our first outdoor meet for 2023. Mary and Faye have already booked up, but there are spaces, as we don't have a top number. It's the New Year Plant Hunt on the 3rd of January, which we're going to do in Rosemarkie. And I've booked a table at the Crofters Cafe for afterwards so that we can defrost. So if anyone's interested in taking part, then get in touch with me. I may have to increase the booking if it's very popular. But the last time we were in Rosemarket, I think we got something like 20 or 21 species. So let's see if we can make that total this next year.